America had only been in the war for some 18 months, and the conflict had hardly touched the lives of the civilian population. But the relief at the armistice in November 1918 was as great in America as in Britain and France. People really did believe that the peace that had been won at such great cost signalled the end of all major wars. President Wilson led the move to set up a League of Nations to cement the peace, and disarmament became the political watchword, with Britain and the United States in the forefront. In November 1921, they convened in Washington an international disarmament conference. Delegates came from all over the world, including Japan, at that time an ally. The focus of the conference was naval strength, the major weapon of all the imperial powers in extending their influence around the world. The object of the conference was the signing of a five-power treaty, which would define precisely the tonnage allowed to the world's navies, the most important being the Royal Navy of Great Britain, the US Navy, and the Imperial Navy of Japan. The British and the US were agreed they would get an equal tonnage of warships. The Japanese delegation were under strict instructions from their government to get as close as possible to parity with the US and UK naval forces as a full ally. This was a major power play for the US. The unwritten agenda for the conference was that they were determined to limit the size of the Japanese fleet in the Pacific, where Japan, ostensibly an ally, was already threatening US supremacy. So this was one the US State Department couldn't afford to lose, and they decided to play it dirty. First, by persuading the US cable companies to pass on copies of the secret Japanese telegrams coming from Tokyo, and then to try to break the Japanese codes and so learn their intentions. The problem was there was no Japanese-speaking codebreaker in America, indeed no official codebreaking unit. So they called in Herbert Yardley. Yardley was a brilliant, intuitive codebreaker. He served as a major in the US Army and had been sent to Europe during the war to see the work of the British codebreakers. On his return, he was set up in a completely secret black chamber, as it was called, unknown even to the president, to break foreign diplomatic codes, including those of the US allies. It was housed in a modest little brownstone house on East 37th Street in New York, paid for by a secret slush fund, set up by the US State Department and the Department of Military Intelligence. The intercepted cables from Tokyo to the delegation in Washington ended up on Yardley's desk. But Yardley couldn't read Japanese and had no prior knowledge of Japanese encoding systems. He was starting from scratch, and he had to crack the messages within a matter of days if it was to serve any purpose. In a quite remarkable display of code-breaking genius, working round the clock, Yardley broke the Japanese codes. He learned to his great surprise that the Japanese negotiators were being instructed by Tokyo to back down if it looked as if resistance would cause severe friction with the US. It was a crucial moment in the negotiations. With the prior knowledge of their willingness to concede, the US and Britain were able to force the Japanese to accept a tonnage limitation set at only half the UK and US fleet levels. It was a major political victory. The Japanese delegation left the conference shattered at their defeat, but not for a moment suspecting that their high-grade diplomatic codes had been penetrated. The American Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, had every reason to be pleased by the triumph, but it is by no means certain that he knew just how that victory at the conference had been achieved, that the State Department was funding what was in effect an illicit, undercover code-breaking operation. That was to prove Yardley's downfall. He might have expected to be discreetly rewarded for his remarkable achievement. Instead, When Henry Stimson became Secretary of State for President Hoover and discovered the existence of Yardley's Black Chamber, he immediately closed it down with the famous, if naive observation, "Gentlemen, do not read each other's mail."
Yardley was in some difficulty. Because he'd been paid out of a slush fund, officially he didn't exist, so there was no pension. It was 1929, Wall Street had crashed, millions of Americans were out of work. Yardley had a wife and young son to support and no prospects. He decided to write a book about his exploits, and it was dynamite. Yardley spilled all the beans. The secret spying on the British, French, Russian and Japanese diplomatic codes, the full story behind the deception at the Washington Conference, and much more. To make matters worse, the book was serialized in the popular Saturday Evening Post and became a raging bestseller. In Japan, it caused outrage. Their nation had been made to lose face on the international stage, and the outcome was inevitable. The Japanese, like the Germans, began to investigate codes that they believed to be unbreakable, codes created by machines.
Yardley was never to work again as a codebreaker for the United States, and he died in obscurity in 1958. Belatedly, he was offered some official recognition when he was buried with full military honours at the Arlington Cemetery. But his standing as a remarkable codebreaker remains secure. Historian David Kahn.
Herbert Yardley was one of the most remarkable characters in the history of cryptology. He was a womanizer, he was a poker player, and he was a drinker. But he was also an extraordinarily excellent codebreaker. And even though, toward the middle of his life, he wrote this book, The American Black Chamber, which revealed too many American code-breaking secrets, nevertheless, his activity in breaking the Japanese naval code and diplomatic code at the time of the Washington Disarmament Conference proved an enormous boon to the United States. It enabled us to gain naval superiority over Japan, substantial naval superiority, which proved of great value during World War II.
But just as Yardley's career was drawing to an end, another remarkable codebreaker was emerging from the shadows at a time of America's greatest need. If Yardley's greatest strengths were his superb flair and intuition, his successor relied upon the keenest mathematical analysis. He is now regarded as the greatest codebreaker of the pre-computer age. His name, William Friedman.
He was hired by the US Army to replace the sacked Herbert Yardley. It was a decision that would change the course of world history. Friedman and his young bride Elizabeth, whom he married in 1920, were both codebreakers. Elizabeth worked for a government agency trying to stop the activities of the bootleggers during the Prohibition years. She had some success. She managed to break the codes they used to arrange pick-up points to transfer booze from Canada and Latin America. Due to Elizabeth Friedman's efforts, many shipments were intercepted and dealt with in a very simple and effective way. They were smashed. It must have been a risky business, with gangsters like Al Capone involved. William Friedman believed strongly that with the growing complexity of its international relations, America had to develop a powerful and permanent code-breaking unit. So he began to train young mathematicians in the art and science of cryptanalysis, a word that he himself coined. One of the original 3 recruits was a young maths teacher from Virginia, Frank Rowlett. Rowlett had gained maximum marks in the civil service entrance exam. Seeing the results, Friedman offered Rowlett a position as cryptanalyst, a word unknown to the young Virginian.
The salary offered with this position was $2,000 a year, which was more than both my wife and I were making as school teachers. And we decided that it was worth trying. Also, it had the opportunity of giving each of us a chance to go to Washington, where we never visited.
So Rowlett duly reported to Friedman at the old munitions building in Washington.
It was during this first exchange with Friedman when he got through inquiring if I had a place to live, and had I been to Washington before, and just sort of simple conversation, that I found an opportunity to ask him what a cryptanalyst was supposed to do. And he said, "You mean you don't know what a cryptanalyst is?" And I said, "I never heard the word before." Then he looked out the window and he said, "Well, that's not strange." He says, "I just invented it."
It was 1931, and US Army listening posts were copying coded signals from Japan as the Japanese armies began the ruthless invasion of Manchuria. America realized that these were just the opening moves of a bid to extend Japanese influence right across Southeast Asia. Japan had also built a huge new fleet, new battleships and new aircraft carriers, far beyond the tonnage provisions of the Washington Treaty signed just 10 years before. It was becoming clear that Japanese expansionist ambitions were beginning to overshadow US interests in the Pacific, and America too began to extend its Pacific fleet. Throughout the late 1930s, as the Japanese relentlessly overran China, their increasing military radio traffic was being intercepted and decoded by Friedman's small group of codebreakers using the classic methods of analysis that Friedman had developed. They had penetrated virtually every Japanese coding system. Then, late in 1938, it happened. US Army radio intercept stations in the Pacific began to pick up ciphers that US codebreakers could no longer read. At first, they were baffled. Then they realized that the Japanese, like the Germans, had switched their high-grade diplomatic traffic to machine-generated codes that were regarded as being virtually impregnable. Friedman did not, of course, know the Japanese name for the encoding machine, so he codenamed the new unreadable cipher Purple.
Of course, we were collaborating with the Navy at that time, and both of us were very anxious to get right onto this new machine, this thing that we early on named Purple.
Friedman knew that the Purple traffic was vital because it would contain revealing instructions to Japanese embassies around the world. Basically, the whole of Southeast Asia lay exposed. The Philippines, Dutch East Indies, Indochina, Malaya, all weakly garrisoned by peacetime armies, all rich in the two raw materials of which Japan was being starved, rubber and oil. Moreover, America was almost totally unprepared for war, its army and navy ill-trained, its air force virtually non-existent. And as Japan became increasingly belligerent, knowing its immediate intentions became a matter of national urgency. Only the breaking of Purple could reveal that intelligence.
With his small but now experienced team, Friedman was ordered to concentrate on breaking the seemingly unbreakable Japanese machine codes. They had a mountain to climb.
All we had was pen and paper and a calculator. One of these desk-type things with 9 rows of keys, 10 columns wide or something like that.
The great strength of machine codes is that they create billions, trillions indeed, of cipher alphabets, layer upon layer of complexity. To try to break that with paper and pencil could take literally years. To speed things up, Friedman modified 3 early IBM business tabulating machines as crude computers. His objective, put simply, was to try to create a detailed mathematical model of the Japanese machine so that a replica could be built. Day after day, 24 hours a day, the IBM machines tested millions of possible solutions, but progress was painfully slow. A major problem was the alien and opaque nature of Japanese, which few Americans then understood. And time was running out. The Second World War had broken out in Europe, as Friedman's team worked on in total secrecy. They labored round the clock, virtually sealed away in room 3416 of the building on Constitutional Avenue in Washington. Friedman drove himself relentlessly as the team inched its way down through the layers of mathematical complexity. Slowly, his health gave way under the strain. He became old before his time. But slowly, steadily, patterns were emerging.
Friedman must have known about the Enigma machine. Indeed, some of his team argued that Japan probably borrowed Enigma machines to create the Purple Code. Friedman reasoned against that on the basis that Purple was a diplomatic code sent to and from embassies. Therefore, they didn't have to be restricted to a small field machine, which Enigma was, ideal for short tactical messages, but totally unsuited for long diplomatic signals. And of course, he was perfectly right. Friedman may have had some assistance from espionage because his achievement was so colossal, we just don't know. But the breakthrough came when he reasoned that the Purple machine must work using the selectors and relays from an automatic telephone exchange.
The array of telephone selectors, the heart of the Purple machine, created trillions of possible cipher alphabets. Theoretically, it was completely unbreakable. Working only from intercepted messages, over a period of 18 months, Friedman and his team had climbed the mountain. They produced a replica of the unseen and unknown Japanese enciphering machine. It was a staggering achievement. This is that historic Purple machine, only allowed to be filmed for the first time 50 years after the war. Basically, it consists of two state-of-the-art typewriters plugged together via a complex battery of relays and plug boards, creating an impenetrable electrical maze. But to use it, you simply typed in the message on one side, it was typed out in the Purple code on the other side. If Friedman's solution was correct, then his replica would work in reverse, deciphering the intercepted signals. In August 1940, Leo Rosen and Frank Rowlett ran the first test run.
I was working with Rosen. This was about 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night because we wanted to finish this thing. We'd waited so long for it. We just couldn't wait any longer. And so I got a message, and we set up the machine to the indicator, and I started typing. And the first few groups, the first 3 or 4 that I typed in the machine came out beautifully on the other end. The Japanese plain text that we knew, because we'd saw the message by hand earlier, had to come out. And then all of a sudden, the machine stopped operating. And after a little puzzling about it, Rosen concluded that we had failed to put in relay that was needed, a condenser over the relay points that was needed for the master relay. And so we got hold of one of those, and he installed it, and lo and behold, it worked just like a charm from then on. So we were ready to demonstrate it to the chief signal officer next morning, and also to Friedman and General Lakin, and the others who were in the chain of command that were interested in what we were doing.
And what was their reaction?
Amazement and great pleasure.
The breaking of Purple was also the breaking of Friedman. He basically retired. But his achievement ranks very high indeed in the annals of code breaking. David Kahn again.
William Friedman was probably the most brilliant cryptanalyst we've ever seen. He engendered theoretical ideas which took cryptography out of its kind of primitive land into the new world of statistical analysis in a very sophisticated way. And later on, in the 1940s, early 1940 and 41, he led and organized and directed and inspired the team that, using some of his techniques, cracked the Japanese Purple cipher machine, which was quite possibly the greatest feat of cryptanalysis the world had ever seen.
The decoded messages from Purple were given the codename Magic, and they were circulated only to the 10 most senior personnel in the USA, and always by hand, including to the President and the Chiefs of Staff. On December the 1st, 1941, the Codebreakers revealed that Tokyo had instructed all its embassies to destroy all code and cipher machines, except one in Washington. What they didn't know, because of the complete radio silence, was that on November the 25th, a huge Japanese task force had left harbor and sailed east, out into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. A clock had been set ticking. On the evening of the 6th of December 1941, the Codebreakers in Washington intercepted a long and involved message to the Japanese embassy in Washington with strict orders not to pass it on to the US government before 1 p.m. the next day. It certainly didn't declare war. Essentially, it broke off relations. President Roosevelt was reading the decoded message that same evening. But it wasn't until late next morning, Sunday the 7th of December, that the generals in Washington made the connection. 1 p.m. Washington time actually was dawn in the Pacific. It was too late. Dawn in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet had reached its target. The attacking aircraft were already taking off from the fleet carriers, shaping course for a still sleeping island, the island of Hawaii, on a still, calm Sunday morning. Friedman and his team had done a brilliant job in breaking purple. With only a fraction more luck, the attack on Pearl Harbor might have been detected and the whole course of the war in the Pacific profoundly altered.